Good evening, everyone. Once again, welcome to this year's webinar series of the Sri Lankan Society of Lifestyle Medicine. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Ilan Kokotek, not just as a distinguished American family physician, but also as a valued colleague and a dear friend. Dr. Kokotek earned his medical degree from Rowan University School of Osteopathic Medicine and a BA in biology. He's currently pursuing additional board certification in preventive medicine at Johns Hopkins University. His professional journey is driven by profound commitment to the prevention and reversal of chronic diseases. He's deeply invested in the power of lifestyle, community, and policy interventions as vital tools in this effort. So his work extends beyond individual health, as he's particularly passionate about environmental health and the broad implications of climate change. Dr. Kokotek is keenly aware how our collective behaviors contribute to both personal and planetary health challenges, and he is dedicated to exploring the complex interplay between financial interest, food systems, and the built environment. On a personal note, I had the privilege of working closely with him, and I can attest to the unwavering dedication to the well-being of others, as well as his knowledge and insightful perspectives on the broad implications of our healthcare practices. I'm confident that his words will leave us a lasting impact on all of us today. Dr. Ilan Kokotek, it's over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate the kind words and for you all having me here today. I hope it's not too late in the evening for you all to enjoy and be present for this. I'm glad we were able to find a time when we're all awake together. So yeah, thank you again for having me. And yeah, we're going to be talking about some topics that I find particularly interesting and meaningful, and something I discuss frequently is parallels between different levels of organization and biology and just layers of life, really. So which is a common concept within biology, which I had the BA in, and so I've found myself really running with a lot of concepts in that through my medical education and public health education, and so I'm excited to share that with you today. So today's talk, maybe it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but we'll be talking about why industrial agriculture needs a lifestyle change. So first off, before we get into the thick of it, I'll just share that I don't have any financial conflicts of interest, no disclosures to announce. And I want to start off with bringing up an image here. So this is, a representation that you may have seen regarding, in trying to get the public's attention to reduce their carbon footprints, trying to achieve carbon neutral. If I could even get, by raise of hands, whether on your camera or even in the reaction, have you seen this sort of message? Have you felt guilty by being told this sort of message? And, have you experienced that onus being put on you as an individual of, you got to take personal responsibility. The climate is all on you. And if you reduce your individual emissions, you can make the difference. Who here? Yeah, if folks can raise their hands, I see a couple coming up there. And yeah, it's very true that we as individuals have a role to play, right? So we, of course, are participating in this collective society, and our consumer choices do end up influencing industry in terms of, what sells and what is being consumed and what markets are available. But in many ways, this tactic, it's similar and connected to what has been done within the plastic industry, which also is petrochemical, right? So the fossil fuels and our plastics are all really made by the same petrochemical industries. And it's really part of their playbook to shift the responsibility onto the individual rather than for them to confront the reality that is they are by and far responsible, because we're surrounded by consumer choices that depend heavily on them. And it's a way for them to shift blame and continue raking in their profits without creating any actual meaningful change themselves as the ones who are continuing to propagate they're really essentially unhealthy products for all of us and the planet. So, it can create feelings of us not being enough. It can create concepts of carbon neutrality. So then we focus our attention onto, oh, well, if we just reach, if we have industries just reach this neutral label, then it's okay, right? And we can kind of dispel our concerns about it. Oh, it's being taken care of. Oh, I recycled, or the industries reach their neutral level. But this can create a lot of problems and really serve as a distraction. And just to also put things into perspective, the fossil fuel burning alone isn't really even enough by our current estimations to stop the potential impending 2-degree elevation in temperature that will likely lead to untold cascades in these complex systems. The IPCC estimates that if we stopped fossil fuel burning today, we still would be producing enough emissions in other realms that we would have greenhouse gases leading to elevation above the 2 degrees. So we need to do some other interventions. And actually, that's where a lot of our focus will be on today. Obviously, we're going to be talking about the agricultural system, as the title indicated for today's presentation. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of seeing the agricultural system and some of its own intricacies, let's consider some parallels. So, folks tuning into the call are largely physicians involved in the healthcare system. And so I think a great way for us to start out would be to think about some of the very common, very real chronic conditions that we face as healthcare providers, as lifestyle medicine doctors, right? And think about how our training allows us to approach these sorts of things. So how does conventional Western medicine, so not necessarily lifestyle medicine, but just conventional Western medicine, treat hypertension or diabetes? And if anyone, feels brave enough to raise a hand, call out some answers, I'm happy to hear from you. Any brave souls today? All right, so
I mean,
yeah,
mostly,
go ahead.
Mostly medication based, often brief consultations, and with a lot of pill burden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's it's almost like you read my slides there, right? So there can be some mention of lifestyle interventions, but it's usually very brief and trite. Things like eat better, exercise more, lose weight, wear your CPAP. But it's often not really getting to the nitty-gritty of, well, how do we do those things? It's just kind of a vague instruction. There's often a lot of stepwise increase in pharmacotherapies, which folks may be on for life. And if we're not seeing the solution, we might just add another medication and another medication. And this cascade can just continue. Yeah, I see somebody mentioned the DASH diet. Yep, that's a very common recommendation. Certainly things that we would do. Thanks for mentioning that. Okay, and then what do we do in lifestyle medicine? Or actually, but before I'll let that thought percolate, but before we get there, I want to also mention a common thing that we do when we're treating hypertension, treating diabetes clinically is we may end up focusing on one specific number, right? So we say somebody has hypertension, but often all we're really able to monitor is the blood pressure itself. But if you think back to pathophysiology, hypertension in and of itself is not just blood pressure. It's actually vascular dysfunction, right? We can have loss of elasticity and decreased compliance of the blood vessels. We have dysregulation of the vascular tone, but that's not something we can very easily measure. So because we can't measure it, we end up just honing in on this one thing, which isn't really the whole picture. And similarly with diabetes, we'll often focus on A1C or the blood glucose itself. But these numbers are just surrogates, right? Those numbers aren't insulin resistance themselves. They're not metabolic dysfunction in and of themselves, but we can fixate on these numbers and then we lose the forest for the trees in those instances. So that's something that I think is very common in Western thought in general. And that's really going to be a big topic and theme for what we're discussing here today. So then, okay, what do we do that's different in lifestyle medicine? How do we treat hypertension or diabetes? What are things that we do in lifestyle medicine? Feel free to enter it in the chat. You can raise your hand and share, or even just pipe up. I don't mind.
I think mixture of a couple of interventions. For instance, we can use a group shared intervention, shared medical appointments driven by weekly, monthly sessions, or perhaps a specific program driven by the DASH diet and physical exercises, and a combination of addressing a few pillars, as well as that's usually recommended for especially grade 1 hypertension now as the primary mode of treatment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think those are all excellent points, and we as you mentioned, we might be having group visits. We're going through the different pillars, so we're actually spending time with the patient and exploring these concepts with them. And we go through the pillars, right? We're going to focus on their diet. We're going to focus on what activity goals a person might have, and these are quality of life issues. What are things that individual might want to attain in their lives. And we will emphasize sleep hygiene, right? How well are we actually sleeping? How well are we managing our stress? What are our interpersonal relationships like? Are we avoiding exposure to toxic substances? So some colleagues of mine, a mentor of mine, likes to include connection with nature as an additional pillar within the lifestyle medicine. And I'm just taking a look at the chat here. I see some people have mentioned in here. Yeah, so making sure we know what actually works for the patient. So developing relationships, figuring out the intricacies of that individual's life. which I think, you know, goes in with really spending the time with folks as well. Yeah, I see people mentioning, you know, all the different pillars. That's really great. And another thing too that I think we may not recognize enough is often in conventional perspectives, we tend to think about avoiding the untoward or negative outcomes, right? So we often fixate on, okay, we really don't want you to get end-stage renal disease, so we want to control your blood pressure and your diabetes. We really don't want you to get heart attacks, so we want to control these. We want to, you know, prevent the possibility of getting an amputation. And so we're often framing things in this negative way instead of what can we actually get? How well could we live? And I think that's a paradigm that lifestyle medicine can take as well. You know, really developing an understanding of what goals the patient has and what they want to achieve in their life, and use that as motivation. You know, a carrot instead of the stick. I think is a wonderful perspective that we can take within it. And you know, so then next, and actually I see somebody said a little more in the chat. So yeah, negotiate what practically works, right? Because there's a lot of things to navigate in here. And you know, so what I'd like to mention next is that actually addressing planetary health and feeding our nations needs to follow an analogous philosophy to lifestyle medicine rather than conventional or corporate perspective where and really focusing on acute negative outcomes. We actually need to shift towards a holism, towards a perspective of understanding how the system works in its entirety and have a more comprehensive approach. So now that we've spoken a little bit about some of, you know, the labels we may place on individual health conditions and how that can narrow our perspectives, but that it could actually, you know, through lifestyle medicine, we're actually able to address, you know, the physiology and pathophysiology themselves rather than simply covering up or modifying the metric that we can measure. I think it's worthwhile to explore and navigate an understanding of what really is going on in industrial agriculture. What are some of the consequences of widely prevalent practices? So then we can have more of a holistic perspective and understand limitations to what is being so commonly practiced and affecting all our collective lives. So, you know, I got these three icons here. Firstly, we'll talk about the use of heavy machinery in agriculture. So this can contribute to so first of all, we're referring to things like tilling, using tractors, and you know, there of course there are some benefits to this, right? That's why we're doing it. That's why it's become prevalent economically, and it's, you know, it can be seen as relatively efficient when you consider the volume of produce that could be collected, for instance, or the number of man hours needed to work, right? Because if you have one tractor, that could theoretically, you know, in like a monoculture type setting, replace many individual manual laborers, and so we can harvest quickly. But it then contorts things in terms of how the system is working. And we'll talk a little bit about monoculture a bit later, but also things just directly related to the machinery. The machines themselves are going to create emissions. They're also actually, as we till, we disturb the soil and we end up releasing what had been fixated carbon from the soil into the atmosphere. So, and then as we release that, the soil becomes less healthy and less fertile. because it doesn't have those natural compounds from the previously existing root systems, which are then going to decompose and become nutritious for your next crop. But then also, as these heavy machines pass over the soil, we end up packing it down. And so, it's really, it can be useful when we have such a uniform crop to go through, where so we're kind of priming the soil to get it ready for mass planting and mass harvesting, but it comes at a cost because we end up depleting the quality of that soil. So it's really a short gains type of game rather than an investment in our longitudinal food security. So then moving on, our next icon was this pill bottle, and that's really to represent the chemical industrial side of industrial farming. And so this is heavily based on inputs, and I think this actually really closely ties in with the prevalence of pharmacologic interventions within Western medicine. Focusing on inputs and reductionist thinking. And what we often do, bringing back to the thought of monocultures, is we end up sapping all the nutrients of one specific subset, whatever that monoculture actually requires from the soil. And this creates another imbalance in the soil, because instead of fixing nitrogen and bringing fertility back to the soil, we really just sap it out by having this uniformity of crops in one swath of land. And this also makes it easier for the soils to come apart and actually leave the land in runoff. And there's further difficulties with this, because then we end up using artificial fertilizers, right? So we create these industrial fertilizers, we spray it on the land. A very small portion of it actually stays there in the land where it was sprayed, and the majority runs off into our waterways. And so we continue to leach nutrients from the soil where we're actively trying to grow food, and then we send nutrients downstream through the collecting systems, essentially all the way into the ocean. And that's where we end up getting our algal blooms, right? So then we end up bleaching coral, we end up raising the sea temperatures, and so then we get compounding effects. And it's not as if these chemicals just go away after they've had the runoff into the oceans. They then are dispersed and present throughout the world, right? So we may consume it in our foods from it being just sprayed directly onto the foods. And this goes for pesticides as well. Could be, and it is, in our foods and in our water, the water we drink and the water we bathe in. It's in the air we breathe and the air that we're just present in constantly. So we're allowing these unnatural chemicals, which have potential inflammatory and even carcinogenic properties, or endocrine disrupting properties, and we're kind of just letting this run wild without much mitigation here. And in many cases, our regulatory systems are rather behind on the production and development of these new pesticides, and fertilizers. So these are really big issues, and as you could tell, it's not just a linear, simple thing. I like thinking. I was mentioning thinking in parallels, microcosms, macrocosm type of thinking, and using these chemical industrial fertilizers is akin to megadosing a micronutrient for nutrition. And we know that that's not really a way to achieve longitudinal health. You actually need a balanced, comprehensive diet that has, you know, a wide variety of different micronutrients, and of course you need the macronutrients for energy as well. But if we megadose any one thing, that is not what will actually bring us health and create a healthy system. It might promote, you know, short-term gains in whatever realm you're supplementing, but it can also lead to long-term consequences. So, you know, obviously, these things it's common practice, and it's something that can really affect us all. And so I'm trying to drive home the point that we often have simplistic and linear thinking within industrial agriculture, rather than forcing industry to consider the entire realm of consequences in these non-linear cascades, because biological systems, they don't function in the manner that we often pretend they do within our current scientific thought. We tend to think, okay, if I add this one thing upstream, it leads to this output downstream. But there are actually several interconnecting positive and negative feedback loops. And so the systems are within biology are far more complex than the fabricated systems that we come up with in business. And without representation of that true complexity, it ends up leading to unintended consequences. So let's now also talk about animals in particular, and you know, mostly here I'm referring to CAFOs, that's concentrated animal feeding operations. So when it comes to these, you know, so long as an animal is coming from an operation like this, I'd honestly consider it to be a highly processed food, right? So it has decreased physical activity, so it's not maintaining its own health via physical activity. It may experience increased stress. You know, living in quarters like these, highly packed in with other individuals. Often they're eating fattening, grain-based diet, living in unhygienic conditions, receiving administration of both hormones and antibiotics, you know, rather than being out roaming, you know, having clean ambient air and being active throughout the day. Now, this isn't to say that I don't think it's possible for animals to be part of a healthy diet. I think they could be. But eating an unhealthy animal that's raised in these circumstances is unlikely to bring us health, right? You know, they're full of synthetic and inflammatory chemicals and compounds, and there's a lot of other consequences that I'm sure some of you are having come to mind already from this discussion. So, you know, aside from the individual health consequences of consuming a lot of trans fat from animal products, there are also collective issues that we incur from farming in this sort of way. So it's really inefficient. We use inordinately large swaths of land and high volumes of water just to grow the food for these animals to eat, which we could eat ourselves, right? So we're growing food for the food, and we could actually save that land and produce more food and save water by transitioning folks to a more plant predominant or even whole food plant-based diets. Factory farms also stir up ethical concerns in terms of proper treatment of other organisms, and they even contribute directly to an inordinate volume of waste. So There's something that they refer to as manure lagoons, which these organizations use. So these structures here at the bottom of that image, those are the housing buildings which have thousands and thousands of animals within them. And then those ponds essentially are manure lagoons, which is where all this excess waste is sequestered. And there's a copious volume that we don't really have a great way of dealing with. Sometimes it's used to spray over vegetation, which can lead to outbreaks. We also, sometimes there's flooding, and then a whole community gets exposed to massive amounts of fecal material that's resulting from this fashion of agriculture. And on top of that, first of all, living in these tight quarters is already a big proponent of spread of infectious disease. But even more so, when we give these highly concentrated populations of animals antibiotics, we are creating a breeding ground for antimicrobial resistance. So we're really creating a perfect storm in terms of creating our own problems in the future for, again, our individual and public health by creating communicable diseases that we will not be able to fight, or currently are not able to fight without significant innovation. And so, you know, a great way to slow this down would be to not raise animals in these highly concentrated animal feeding operations in the first place, and to not use antibiotics so heavily in their propagation either. So now I wanted to just show you a little bit of the breakdown. I was already talking a bit about the inefficiencies in terms of the land use, but so if we consider the entire surface of the Earth, you know, 71% of that is going to be ocean, or water, and then 29% is land. And then if we think about the habitable proportion of land, only about 71% of the available land surface is actually habitable for us. So there's glaciers, there's barren areas, and then we're actually using 46% of the land for agriculture. And then, you know, of course, there's a fair amount that's forest. We got some shrubs and other subcategories. And then moving forward, we're actually using 77% of that agricultural space for livestock, for meat and dairy industries, and only 23% for our produce. So think about how inefficient that is. And then if we even look at how this breaks down nutritionally, the global calorie supply is from use of that livestock land is only accounts for 18%. So we're using a completely disproportionate amount of land to grow these unhealthy foods that create environmental and individual health issues. And it's an inefficient use of land. So we could feed far more people, and we could give them healthier food, and we could free up living space or even just natural spaces to serve as more landmass to provide the ecological services of cleaning our air, capturing CO2, you know, sequestering carbon, filtering water, and keeping our rivers and oceans clean through the root systems. But instead, we're investing heavily in livestock practices which are inefficiently using land and creating a myriad of health issues. So I know everything that you know, essentially I've spoken about so far has been pretty bleak. So let's talk about, well, what can we do, right? And I think I've alluded to some of the ideas here already. But you know, one of the biggest areas that is developing and being explored is this concept of regenerative agricultural practices. So, I already spoke a little bit about with the livestock, we could, adopt practices like roaming livestock on grasslands, and who will, by the way, passively fertilize the soils anyway. So if we have rotations of where we're doing, where we're growing produce um, versus having the livestock roam, we can actually have a cyclical pattern in terms of the soil fertilities. And we can also further limit, as I was mentioning before, the use of steroids and antibiotics when we're not forcing them to live in such tight quarters. There's also practices such as interplanting, right? So we were talking about monocultures before, which I think I failed to mention earlier, that monocultures also make the crops very susceptible to pests, right? Because you're concentrating many of the same species of food for us in one place. So then all of their predators are going to come and eat that or infect it, or whatever pathogen it may be. They'll be able to spread easily because we're keeping it all tightly and uniformly grown, which then encourages us to use more pesticides. So an alternative to that would be concepts like interplanting. So actually finding which vegetative species plant species can grow together, and often there are combinations that lead to higher yields than we would with monocropping, but it does take a lot of manual labor, because also with these practices, as I was mentioning before, you can't really use machines in the same manner, at least not with the most prevalent forms of technology in terms of, just plowing and tilling and using harvest machines that are somewhat indiscriminate, because if you have an interplanting of several different species of plant, each type of plant, and you can still use rows to some degree with this, but each type of plant actually needs its own method of harvesting. And so just having a blanket swath of monoculture uh, is efficient industrially, but it actually may not be as productive per land area. It might not be as nutritious per land area. And obviously it has a lot of problems that we had discussed already. And a big part relating both to that roaming practice I mentioned and the ecological and sorry, the interplanting is actually trying to use ecology, or in some sense I kind of like to think of it as the physiology of the planet, to our benefit. So understanding how the systems actually work and interact together. Even simple things like planting flowers that attract a specific insect to the area, which might serve as a predator to a pest that harms a given plant you're trying to grow. So that way you can actually use the community and ecology of the area to manage and limit pests instead of needing to use chemical additives. Of course, we do need to make this all worthwhile for farmers. And so, this is a big ask. We're talking about, in some sense, having a cultural awakening to how important agricultural work is and its centrality to all of our lives and all of our health. So how are we going to do that? So we certainly need policy changes, right? This isn't going to just change overnight from us saying this is what we want. We need meaningful local, national, and international policy changes to make food policy make sense. In large part, industrial money, especially here in the U.S., and I'm sure this really is a global problem. Industrial money has been influencing a lot of political systems, and it ends up becoming its own self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of propagation of negative practices, because if we allow money to be power, then these corporate interests that already have the power are able to continue to compound in their own detrimental practices. Before even getting into the full talk about some of the caveats of money, I think some important levers that could be pulled would even be the onus of labeling of food, right? So in much of the world, we actually have organic and regenerative producers labeling their foods as such, but we don't require agricultural practices that are detrimental to the environment to be labeled on their products. So we're often allowing these things to go unnoticed. We are, as consumers, are often actually oblivious to the consequences and resource investments that go into producing a lot of the things we take for granted. And because of that, we actually can't participate in the market appropriately, because none of us can act within a market in our own self-interest without equity of information. And so labeling is really an important step in terms of achieving a more just food system. And so we need to have labels about processed foods, about the resources used, because otherwise we have no idea what the externalized costs are. And that actually gets a bit into some of the other money concerns. But before I get there, even creating policies which we're hopefully in the process of further and further progressing this here in the US, but making sure we have healthy food in our schools, right? That we're developing healthy diets within the education system as we're raising our next generations, and also healthy food options in hospital facilities. It's been unfortunately and ashamedly common in the US to have fast food storefronts within hospitals. And so allowing this mixed signal in a place that's supposed to bring health, but then we're selling and promoting the items that actually take it away, this can be a real problem. So now focusing a bit more on the economic side, I was talking about acting in rational self-interest and incentives of money. And, similar to labeling, actually using the levers of the capitalist system can go a long way, so long as we're living within these structures. So if we tax highly processed foods or tax foods that have negative environmental consequences to their production, then that can reduce their consumption. And then if we subsidize the foods that are whole and more plant-based, again, we can improve our individual health while improving our environmental health and the planetary health. But otherwise, we have these perverse incentives. And again, as I was mentioning, the externalized costs. If it's cheaper to make the option that is less healthy for the individual, less healthy for the environment, then we're actually being incentivized to make those less healthy choices. And so we've created a system that incentivizes poor behavior, both for our individual and collective well-being. So, really developing a labeling system, a tax system that tries to target all the investments and consequences that go into food production and create a more central role in food to have the public realize the importance of our consumer decisions, but also of the corporate decisions, because they do have their own positive feedback loop between each other. And, the corporations want to produce what we consume, and we also consume what is advertised to us and mass produced. So we need to find ways to regulate these things to be in our interest, instead of just a suggestibility and a manipulative market, which is often heavily manipulated just through these financial incentives. So in summary here, what can we do? We need to have a broad understanding of, in the same way that we do to truly manage an individual's chronic conditions, we need a broad understanding of what is at play within our food system, within our environmental health, and we need a more integrative and holistic perspective rather than employing a reductionist food system. And through that, we can design and create nurturing systems that serve us all. So thank you all for your time and attention. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments folks may have. I can go ahead and stop the screen share. And yeah, thank you all for having me.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Really appreciate it. I think it was a wonderful talk. We can wait for, if anyone has a question. I think there's a few that people have already shared when they were filling up the Google form.
Okay.
But maybe we can give a few minutes if anyone wants to unmute yourself and share any questions you have. Okay, I think we have one in the chat.
Yes, I see a comment by Fontip. So yeah, she had mentioned commercial determinants of health, and yeah, this is a really big factor. There are a lot of buzzwords going around about different types of determinants of health, but the commercial determinants of health are essentially a concept regarding what we're exposed to in terms of advertisements and in terms of our own financial well-being and status, and how all these factors and influences come together to actually guide the decisions that are available to us and the decisions we ultimately make. And so a lot of our health really is determined by financial forces at play. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and to add to what Dr. Kokotek has nicely explained over the last close to 1 hour, 45 minutes or so, it's very important that we understand what's happening in highly efficient and productive food markets like in the US right now, because so that we can understand what we should do to prevent that the same thing happening in Sri Lanka and in other low and middle income settings. Because at the moment, as you all know, in Sri Lanka is fairly informal and not consolidated. The food system is not consolidated, but it's moving there. We can see certain elements in through food market chain, supermarket chains that's happening, and also there are no, unfortunately, any even close example to K-Force. But if you can imagine a poultry farm in Sri Lanka, like a typical congested poultry farm, and multiplied by 1,000 times, and imagine all sorts of animals, one particular type of animals in a huge land space with minimal manpower, completely operated by machines. That's something similar to a K4 in the US. So that's something we would want to avoid happening. But then again,
absolutely,
we don't want to advocate for any drastic policy changes, rather to precipitate more negative outcomes as opposed to any tangible benefits that you may have seen in the past happening in Sri Lanka in particular, but rather to advocate something gradual, step by step, sustainable policy changes.
Yeah, and I appreciate. Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, I appreciate you mentioning the concept of consolidation, because that is a big issue here in the US and really globally, because there are a lot of trends that just generally follow as, countries come into more and more prosperity and, unfortunately adopt some bad behaviors, let's say. But there's been consolidation in the US, both on the production side of things. So the number of farms in the US has been ever shrinking, particularly in the last century, and the size of those farms has been ever expanding. And so they're getting bigger and bigger, more industrial, more complex, and more detrimental to the environment and again, I would say in many respects to the quality of the food by making it a more and more processed endpoint. And then similarly, in terms of the organizations that actually retail the food, sell it to us as individuals, those are becoming consolidated as well, and more industrial and more manipulative because as the food becomes consolidated into fewer organizations, the power and financial assets that they hold also become consolidated and their influence compounds as well. So, we often might feel like we have many options of things to buy, but there are actually very few organizations selling us things just under different names. So in some aspects, we perceive lots of choice, but there's so much consolidation that it all goes to the same bucket in many instances, or a handful of
Yeah, that's
buckets.
very true. Yeah. And with that, let me also read the question. I think that was initially posted by Rainey in the Google form. How can we promote lifestyle modifications more effectively, as there are many relevant factors that might hinder this, such as commercial determinants of health, socioeconomic status, etc. If you can briefly answer, we have, I think, a couple of more questions as well.
Yeah, so I think a big part is developing this systems thinking sort of understanding, because when we fall into the convenience of narrow reductionist thinking, we often lose sight of the potential unintended consequences. So having that holistic perspective, which I think is a big part of, my working as a lifestyle metaphysician, a lifestyle medicine physician, a primary care physician, and also within public health, trying to have, a more integrated holistic perspective goes a long way. And actually also engaging with the community, because it's our job as physicians to, you might have heard that the word doctor comes from the Latin docere, which means to teach. And so we have a whole lot of information in our heads, but it's impossible for us to share everything with everyone. So we have to use our discretion of sharing the most important information available with the folks who need that specific information. And so communicating with your communities, with policymakers, and trying to form cultures and policies that actually incentivize the good behaviors rather than falling to these perverse incentives, which poor policy and financial systems actually create.
Thank you. And another one is about the Green Revolution. So with the Green Revolution in the 1960s, 70s, we have increased crops and productivity in the food systems. How do you see regenerative agriculture being sufficiently large enough to feed 8 plus billion people? And is redistribution of food systems and regenerative agriculture alone sufficient?
Yeah, so I think it's possible for it to be sufficient, but I think there needs to be a pretty radical upheaval in terms of how we prioritize things. In as things become industrialized, there's much more focus on efficiency in terms of man hours worked, right? So trying to actually replace people with machines and like create this free time, but there's costs that we often don't embed into those behaviors, which again are detrimental to the environment and to our individual health. And so I think we need to have a shift in terms of reprioritizing the importance of the health of our soils, the quality of our foods, and actually reframe or maybe even rebrand the importance of farming in society, because we need a very large workforce to be able to scale this up in terms of regenerative practices. But the good news is, if we do make this shift away from consuming animal products, that will free up a lot of land for us to be able to produce sufficient food for everyone. And actually, we already can produce sufficient food for everyone. There's just an inordinate amount of food waste and inefficient distribution at this time. But I was mentioning in the beginning that if we just stopped burning fossil fuels today, it wouldn't be enough to avoid the 2-degree threshold. The food industry is actually, and our practices, our agricultural practices, are responsible for around 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's meaningful changes we can make there, and that we actually must make, because just stopping the burning of fossil fuels is not enough.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, absolutely. Distribution and wastage are the two most important factors, I think, right now. Why there are a lot more food for easily feed more than 8 billion people, but it's a distribution and wastage issue. Yeah. And with that, thank you very much, Dr. Kokotek, for your valuable time and the wonderful presentation. We will wrap up our webinar for today, and please stay tuned for the next webinar. And in the meantime, if you have any questions or if you want to get connected with Dr. Kokotek, I think he has shared his contact information. And if you need any details, you can always reach out to us. With that, we will wrap up our session today. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all. Be well.